So, staying focused on job satisfaction, what does or does not contribute to that? You don't need me to tell you that this is something that can quite easily have a long term negative effect on somebody, potentially affecting even their physical health. Workplace stress. Now, you all know generally what stress is. Specifically, it's a state of tension produced by pressures or conflicting demands with which the person cannot adequately cope. And all research indicates that stress caused by or at work is pretty common for a whole bunch of reasons. An unmanageable workload, a colleague that annoys you, an annoying boss, being constantly supervised and micromanaged, a lack of control, having difficulty managing that work-family conflict, low wages, even something like a long commute, sometimes a physically hazardous workplace, and there's likely a whole list of other reasons. This is all going to have a negative psychological effect. The Mental Health Commission of Canada reports that 1 in 5 workers in Canada report having a mental health issue or an illness. Now, you might think this doesn't matter to employers, but stress and mental health problems are a big cause of absenteeism and lower productivity. So even if an employer is not a caring person or a caring company that's really concerned about a worker's well-being for the sake of the workers, they're still going to be concerned about it for their own sake. What has research indicated tends to cause the most workplace stress? Job demands and job decision latitude. It's a combination of these. And job decision latitude means having the autonomy to solve problems as they arise. So what this means is that even if somebody has what is generally considered a high-stress job, like maybe a firefighter or a police officer or a surgeon or a nurse, or they're an executive, even if they were to have a lower income, if they're given the latitude to solve problems on their own and are not micromanaged, they can probably cope with that stress. Yes, they have a lot of expected of them. Yes, it's a stressful job, but they're more likely to be able to handle it if they're given the room to handle it. It's when a worker has high demands placed on them, but are also not allowed to deal with those demands on their own, that unmanageable stress is more likely to occur. These workers are more likely to experience depression and exhaustion. So again, it's interesting that our social side, our emotional side, has such an effect on us even at work, isn't it? Which is something we don't generally expect. Again, the focus is on something intrinsic. Our need to be viewed as capable by other people is really, really strong. Strong enough that it can seriously affect how we feel at work. But there's another layer to this, because for those who work where they are subject to not only the control of others, but also the demands of others, they are especially likely to experience workplace stress. So what I mean is, if they have a boss telling them what to do at the same time that they have other people making demands of them, it's one thing to have a superior tell you what you need to do, to be under their control, to be managed. To a certain degree, we expect that at work. But when you are also subject to the demands of others because of your work, that's going to significantly increase the potential for unmanageable stress. Waiters and waitresses, working retail, airline stewards, working at an airport. I don't know about you, but I think people who work at airports have a certain special kind of personality to be able to handle it. A personal support worker, nurses, and other jobs that require you to interact with the public. I would include teachers having demands made of them by parents who expect more and more and more of teachers. People who have these jobs are especially likely to experience stress at work because they are getting it from all sides, from their superiors and from the people they interact with, their customers or their patients. Now, it used to actually be pretty common that we thought people in higher positions, managers, supervisors, people in professional jobs, the big decision makers. It used to be pretty commonly thought that they would just naturally have less stress than those in lower positions because all they have to do is administer. Keep an eye on things, keep things running smoothly. Make sure everybody else is doing what they're supposed to do. But they are supervising and delegating, not actually doing the work themselves. Research has seriously questioned that. The stress of higher status model states that some higher status, high demand jobs actually increase stress. So while we assume that having a higher status job means that there's less pressure because you're supervising other people to do the actual work, the stress of higher status model says that having more authority at work creates more pressure, and thus higher status workers might actually have more pressure. Sure, they have more autonomy. They're not being micromanaged by somebody else. And we know that having autonomy at work decreases workplace stress. And they're not doing the actual work required, whatever that may be. But their increased authority creates stress itself because they're the person held responsible for the work. The proverbial buck stops with them. They are the one that has to answer if something does not go as planned, if it's not done on time, if something does not adhere to a budget, etc. So that the stress of higher status model says that being the boss or the supervisor is not as stress-free as people like to think. Another group of employees who are especially vulnerable to workplace stress are those in helping professions. Police, firefighters, paramedics, nurses, social workers. Although the majority of research focuses on healthcare professionals. Working in a helping profession, such as healthcare, means that more emotional work is required of an employee. So working with people in physical or mental pain, working in an emotionally charged environment. It's not entirely uncommon for them to experience what is known as compassion fatigue. The emotional and physical exhaustion that causes a diminished capacity to empathize or feel compassion for others because they're always trying to alleviate the pain of others. Now, compassion fatigue is not the same as burnout. Burnout can occur in any profession and always builds up over time. Compassion fatigue is something that occurs when a person provides direct patient or client care. And it can occur pretty quickly. It can have a rapid onset or even be due to one specific incident. You know, we've heard a lot about compassion fatigue for healthcare workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, to the point that in some hotspots after the first year, nurses began to quit because they just couldn't do it anymore. According to the Journal of Clinical Nursing, compassion fatigue during the COVID-19 pandemic was made substantially worse by the stress of bed shortages, staff shortages, lack of ventilators, lack of proper personal protective equipment, the need to self-isolate even from one's own family in order to continue working, as well as some of the public denying there was even a problem, or publicly stating that they thought the government and healthcare system were overreacting. We've had lots of news stories about this. Now, how much of a problem is workplace stress really in regards to mental health? I mean, of course, when something negative happens, it will bother a person. Or if there are stressful situations occurring at work, it will bother them. But how much of a problem is it really? And anyways, isn't stress just part of life as an adult? Shouldn't we all just get better at handling it? The Mental Health Commission of Canada states that about 500,000 people do not go to work every week in our country because of mental health issues. That's a lot of people. 500,000 who miss work every single day. In Canada, about 30% of short, and long-term disability claims are related to mental health problems and illnesses. And this ends up costing the Canadian economy about $50 billion annually. So that's a lot of people having a difficult time dealing with mental health issues, including stress from work, and a lot of money either being spent or lost because of it. The most commonly cited mental health concerns are depression and anxiety. And keep in mind that a worker with a mental health issue has more difficulty accessing workers' comp than somebody with a physical issue. A physical issue you can see, and you can usually provide definitive evidence of it. But how do you prove that your mental health issues began due to work? Which leads us to the three main results of stress at work: turnover, absenteeism, and presenteeism. You know, what options does a person have if they really, really are not satisfied with their job, whatever the reason may be? And I want to be specific here. I'm not talking about people who want their job to be absolutely perfect. We're talking about situations in which the employee is realistic, the employee is being reasonable. Well, our first thought is they can just quit, find a job somewhere else, but that's not always an option. Most adults will not quit unless they already have another job lined up because they can't afford to miss a paycheck. They just cannot be without work because of their financial responsibilities. And this does not necessarily mean they're married with children. Single adults with no children will still need to support themselves and still have financial obligations. I unfortunately know more than one person in this situation. For whatever reason, they really dislike their work or workplace or somebody they work with, and they would love to find a job elsewhere. And when the economy is doing well, people are more likely to quit and go elsewhere because they'll have a better chance of finding another job. The turnover rate refers to the percentage of workers who annually leave a job, whether that's voluntary or involuntary. And in 2018, the turnover rate in Canada was 16%, which sounds kind of high, but that doesn't indicate how many workers quit, how many were fired, and it doesn't indicate how many were employed in seasonal work because the turnover rate includes seasonal workers. So this will vary depending on the kind of job you're talking about. Retail and construction tend to have the highest turnover rates, keeping in mind a lot of construction is seasonal, while utilities, transportation, and education have the lowest turnover rates. So while a turnover rate of 16% every year might seem high, when you take these things into consideration, it's not too bad. In any event, the first result of mental health strains at work is the turnover rate. Keep in mind the short and long-term implications of leaving one job for another, though. When somebody leaves a job, even if they have another one already lined up, this means something. If it's only once, maybe twice in their entire adult life, that's probably not going to have a lot of effect. Although it could possibly affect their retirement savings, their pension, how many years they need to work somewhere to qualify for full pension from that place. They have to figure out, can they transfer their pension from one workplace to another? And if this is something that occurs more often, let's say every 10 years or so somebody's switching jobs, that adds up to a very unstable work history, which will absolutely affect their financial status over age 60. So again, what occurs earlier in your work trajectory, even really early, can affect you at 60 or older. And you know, it's easy to say a person should just quit, and the person themselves may more than once say they're going to quit. But that's easier said than done. And thus, another reaction is to start missing work as much as you can without losing the job. Absenteeism is just that, missing days of work. And employees may have many reasons for doing this. Of course, they're already considered by everybody to be valid reasons, so they're physically ill or they have an injury. or other non-related valid reasons. I missed work one day about 3-4 years ago because it was mid-January. I woke up and realized my house was cold and my furnace was not working, and it was a minus 25 outside. Obviously had to take the day off to get that fixed. Other valid reasons might include looking after a family member, whether that's a child or a parent or even your partner. In Ontario, when a teacher is absent, they can indicate specifically if that is because they themselves are ill or because they need to look after a family member. An employee may be absent because they say they need a mental health day. Maybe they feel like they're so overwhelmed with everything that they feel like they need a breather, or they're so stressed out they're beginning to feel physically exhausted and ill. Because the thing is, people who experience a lot of stress at work are more likely to become physically ill. Mental health is directly related to physical health. And people who have less control over their work tend to be absent more, highlighting again the need to feel viewed as competent at work. If you compare the public and the private sector, in the private sector, an employee is much less likely to have paid sick days or to have as many of them. And there's going to be more absences in the public sector where people are more likely to have paid sick days. So paid sick time was a huge issue regarding work during the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Because, don't go to work if you have any symptoms at all. But what if you don't have paid sick days? That's why I have posted a link here to an article about Walmart, which has a pretty well-known reputation for anybody that does research in terms of employee rights when it comes to sick days. Yeah, so during the COVID-19 pandemic, this was glaringly obvious. So you'd have these essential workers, like in grocery stores, who were unintentionally spreading illness because they had to go to work. They couldn't take time off. The mayor of Brampton, Ontario at the time, Patrick Brown, in an interview with CBC, said discussions from other levels of government about shutting down restaurants and retailers really ignored what residents needed to combat COVID-19. And this is a direct quote from him. I'm exhausted about having debates about that when the real help we need is an isolation center for our essential workers and sick benefits for people who are frankly going to work with symptoms because they can't afford to miss a paycheck. End quote. So it's easy to say, and it was easy to say, that somebody should just stay home from work if they weren't feeling well. That's a great solution. And I have no doubt that people who continued to go to work when they weren't feeling well would have loved to have had that option available to them, but they just didn't. So although many, many, many people complained about having to quarantine at home, it was in fact a privilege that a lot of people did not have. In addition to turnover and absenteeism as the result of workplace stress and generally negative mental health effects, another concern is presenteeism, which might sound odd. The first two you would likely have thought of on your own. Presenteeism is when people still show up for work when they really should not, either because of illness or injury, or because they're so stressed they're just not going to be productive and fully present. And I think a lot of people have joked about this at one time or another. You have a long weekend with Monday off, which is great. But then on Tuesday, when you're back at work, that extra day off makes it really hard to get into the swing of things. Or you attend a class and you sit through it and you seem to be paying attention, but in reality, you've completely zoned out. Yes, professors can identify when that occurs. Presenteeism is serious because of its effect on productivity. You go to work, but you're just not fully there. This is related to ritualism, which means you're just going through the motions at work. You're following procedures, you're following rituals, you do the absolute minimum. And I know we could have a discussion and say, you know what, as long as a job is being completed, what's the big deal? If an employer wants their employees to do more than what they're doing, then the employee should be paid more. Well, presenteeism, and ritualism are not good for an employer for obvious reasons. But it's also not healthy for employees to be disengaged like that. This may be a necessary evil for workers who don't have paid sick days or who don't have time off they can take for whatever reason, so that if they don't show up at work, they're going to be even more stressed because they'll make less money. And again, this is what many people had to do during the COVID-19 pandemic. They didn't have any choice but to go to work if they wanted to pay their rent. So many people who had a cold or the flu or whatever had to go to work, even though every doctor and health official were telling them to stay home. And online people would express their anger at people going to work when they weren't feeling well. But they had to. No one wanted to get into the deeper discussion of the lack of healthcare options for people low-wage jobs. And so far, not much has changed, even though there is wave after wave after wave of COVID of different variants. So let's just kind of summarize so far. Okay, we've looked at job satisfaction and what contributes to it. What contributes to not being satisfied with work, with the two main reasons being job demands and job decision latitude. Compassion fatigue, job turnover, absenteeism, and presenteeism. So with all of these issues, all of these potential sources of different kinds of ill health, why is it that people who work are usually healthier than people who do not work? And that's true across the board, that people who work tend to be healthier than people who do not work. Maybe it's because of a selection effect, meaning that healthy people are more likely to work to begin with. That certainly has at least something to do with it, so part of the reason is like a self-selection effect. But we also know that people who work tend to be healthier than people who do not work because of what working provides a person. Obviously, there is what they gain materially speaking, an income. So they gain materially in terms of being able to support themselves and their family, the ability to buy things. For some, the material benefits of work include health benefits, vision care, dental care, occupational and physical therapy, mental health support, all of that. Working also supports you having a healthier life in terms of having the means to secure stable housing, purchase healthier food and medicines and things not covered by public assistance. So the material benefits of work are very obvious, very clear. Although the benefit of working goes beyond just having money. There are also intrinsic rewards of working. Mental stimulation, social interaction, a feeling of accomplishment, a feeling of self-efficacy, a source of status, having your work as part of your personal identity, all of which contribute to well-being, both mental and physical. This is a big part of the reason why some people have a very difficult time when they retire. They don't seem to know what to do with themselves. They don't seem to be able to adapt very easily to daily life without going to work. They really don't know how to identify themselves anymore. You know, from the outside, it seems easy. You were a teacher, now you are a retired teacher. You were a cashier, now you are a retired cashier. But going through it can be difficult because your employment status is such a big part of your personal identity. So mentally speaking, yes, it can be difficult. Now, the kind of work, the character of a person's work will also have an effect on a person's health. As we've already talked about, if the work allows independence and autonomy, if its demands are manageable, it's likely to have a positive effect on your health. If, however, work means always being told what to do, being under surveillance, and is really demanding, then not so much. We know that unstable, precarious work has a negative effect on health. So that means when work is not stable or permanent, it causes stress. How many hours am I going to get this week? Will my contract be renewed? That kind of thing. We know that being in a subordinate work position has a negative effect on health. We know that, of course, if there is discrimination in the workplace, this will have a negative effect on health. And all of these can further be affected by gender, race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity. All of the personal characteristics that you have will interject and intersect. So for all these reasons, we know without a doubt that not working is unhealthy. Being unemployed is unhealthy. I don't mean retirement, I mean not working during the adult stage when most people work. We all talk about how great it would be not to have to go to work, to be able to wake up every day and just do what we want. We all look forward to time off and wish we had more of it. But the fact is, when somebody's unemployed long term, they are more likely to suffer from depression and stress, which then has a negative effect on their health and overall well-being. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody about what you would do if you won the lottery? I think every person's first response is that, of course, they would quit working because they wouldn't need to work anymore. I absolutely would say the same thing. I would not continue working. Needing to meet certain deadlines, creating syllabi, lectures, presentations, marking. But I also know myself well enough to know that I would not be content to not do anything. Could I do it for a few months? Yeah, no problem. That sounds like heaven to me. But the idea of doing absolutely nothing for the rest of my life, I know it would get old. So I know I would volunteer. Yes, I'd probably volunteer in the education system since that's what I'm trained for. So even though we complain about having to work a lot, and believe me, I do the same, work is in fact beneficial. Somebody who is unemployed is more likely to suffer from obviously a lack of income, and even if receiving social assistance, a lower income. But they're also likely to suffer from not being able to have choice in where they live and thus what schools their children attend because of the lower income, a lack of control over their life because of their lack of income, even what kind of food they can purchase, a lack of ability to purchase things that would support better health. So in regards to how work can directly affect your health, working is better for you than not working, physically and mentally. And these are going to be affected by all of your personal characteristics.